It gives me great pleasure to introduce David. I do this every year. Sometimes I wing it, sometimes I read it. I think I'll read it today. Apart from being a great human being, he's my very close friend that I'm delighted to always introduce. He is co-founder and foundation chair of this section. It was Martin, David and myself, but David was the chair. He's a distinguished visiting fellow of the University of Cardiff. Not an easy title to acquire, that one, very rare. And he's been professor at 2 universities in Portugal. And if that's not enough, he holds the first invited chair of transpersonal psychology in the UK at Liverpool John Moores University. And just in his spare time, he's author of more than 40 books, which have been translated into at least 27 languages. We should have got him to tell us those last night in all the different languages, shouldn't we? Together with over 150 papers in academic publications. His most recent books are Psychology, Religion and Spirituality, published in 2003 by Blackwell's. Then, Is There an Afterlife? Published in 2005 by John Hunt. Beyond Death, published in 2009 by Watkins Publishing. And in case he gets bored, he's just started on another one, or is halfway through it, I think. Currently, he's working on a new book exploring the psychology, oh, there's a misprint here. The psychology, Christiana. What is it?
I'm not sure what the book's about. No, it is to do with psychology and Christianity, yes.
Right.
We're calling it Is Christianity Good for You? Which is the publisher's suggestion of a title, not mine. But it seems to be a bit more snappy than mine, which was Psychology and Christianity.
And I suggested Christianity and You.
Yes.
Because we have a joke that all his books could be called Something and You. He's contributed widely not only to all of the areas mentioned, but to the areas of educational psychology, personal development, meditation, and psychic and spiritual experiences. And no doubt next year when I'm introducing him, I'll be saying, and now he's currently working on, and it'll be something new.
Well, who knows?
Okay, so without any further ado, I give you great pleasure. I give you great pleasure.
How true, how true. You give us all very great pleasure.
With his wonderful PowerPoint presentation, I leave you with David.
Well, I have to admit, it's not a PowerPoint. So it was a slip of the tongue because Ingrid knows that I don't give PowerPoint presentations, but I do use, from time to time, slides, either OHPs, or I put them up here using PowerPoint. So from time to time, I'll put up things there which will illustrate, perhaps quotations or whatever, illustrate what I'm trying to say. Just before I start, last night I left my folder on the piano. Ingrid and I were having to carry the wine across, so I thought, well, I don't want to carry my folder as well. The one thing in this place that is never moved is the piano. So I thought I will leave it on top of the piano. And of course, last night the piano was moved, mercifully, because it was... Oh, well done. Well done, thanks. The piano was moved, and Andrew gave us a most wonderful musical concert, and I hope he'll continue with that tonight. So I didn't mind at all, but I just wondered if it was available. It would be quite nice to have it, because there are 1 or 2 things in there I'd like to refer to. Right, well, I'm going to talk today about the nature of the afterlife. One day we're all going to find out for ourselves. In many cases, that will be many, many years ahead. But one day, all of us have to take the same dark journey. And it's either a journey into oblivion, or it's a journey into a higher dimension of reality. there is a tremendous amount of evidence that it is the latter. That evidence, I'm going to try to survey just small little snippets of it. That evidence comes really from three sources. It comes from the great spiritual traditions, and the two that I'm most familiar with are Christianity and Buddhism. Though I've also studied other Eastern religions, Hinduism in particular, and I have a tremendous respect, a tremendous love for all paths to the divine, whatever name we may give to them. But there is then, from these three sources, a tremendous amount of evidence. Firstly, the great spiritual traditions. Secondly, communications through mediums. Now, many people tend to turn off if one mentions mediumship. They think of elderly ladies sitting in darkened seance rooms, fraudulently clicking their fingers or clicking their toes to pretend that they're raps from the deceased. Well, I have to say, for 30 years I've studied mediumship, and I've worked with some excellent mediums, and I've never once come across even the hint of fraud. I've sat with many, many mediums and got absolutely nothing. I've sat with mediums who I've been embarrassed to be with, embarrassed for them because they try very hard but nothing very much comes through. And I've sat with excellent mediums who've given me very good evidence. But I have never found any intention to deceive amongst those that I've been fortunate enough to sit with. So that is the second area. And of course the literature on mediumship is absolutely copious. I have well over 1,000 books on psychical research in my own library at home, probably about 1,500, I would say. And something like 700, 800 are on survival issues alone. And many of those books are by mediums, or they're accounts of mediums, which give the most extraordinary, detailed evidence of survival. I'm only going to refer, obviously, to a tiny part of that. And the evidence that I take mostly from mediumship, apart from my own personal experiences of mediumship, the evidence that I take from mediumship is the evidence that seems to build up a coherent picture of what the afterlife is like. And that picture is actually very, very clear indeed. And in many ways it does link in with the evidence that we have from Buddhism, and the area of Buddhism, well, two areas of Buddhism I'm most familiar with: Tibetan Buddhism, which I studied for many years, and Zen Buddhism, which I also studied for many years. So if the evidence is consistent across religious traditions, that gives us, I think, or gives it further weight. The third area, personal experiences. We call these ADCs, after-death communications. And I'm going to give one or two examples of that as we go along. But I have to try and clear the decks a little bit more by saying that, of course, much of this is based upon psychical research. This is an area that Bernard and myself, and I've no doubt others of you here, have been involved with for many, many years. And speaking personally, although I think Bernard would largely agree with me, the evidence for the reality of psychic phenomena is beyond any reasonable doubt. It is far stronger than much of the rest of science. And the reason why it's so neglected has already been sketched in by Bernard, and I don't need to repeat that. But it's a great sadness, I think, to many of us, that however hard we try, and however broadly we try to give the information, give the evidence to people, science still prefers not to listen. But I have to say, just in passing, that the way to get psychic experiences is to go out and look for them. Bernard sketched two areas, didn't he? One was laboratory work in psychical research, and the other was field work. Well, I've always identified, although I'm trained as a scientist, and of course I'm very, very interested and concerned with the laboratory work, which has been of great value to us. But it happens that my main area has been the field work. I've gone out and I've looked for phenomena. I've gone out and talked to people who have seen apparitions. I've gone out and listened. I've gone out with humility, not with the idea that I am somehow an expert who knows more than these people, but that they are the experts because they've had the experience, and I'm there as a guest. I've sat in certainly darkened rooms and I've seen apparitions. I've seen all sorts of phenomena in the dark. I've sat in broadly, lightly lit rooms like this, and I've seen phenomena. But a lot of phenomena will be very personal and can happen to you personally. Let me give you 3 quick examples. Don't spend too long on this. I want to get on to the stages of the afterlife. I'll give 3 very quick examples. And I'm going to choose those examples as amongst the simplest in my own experience. A very dear friend of mine, one of my PhD students, in fact, from the University of Algarve, was killed in a car crash. And I thought a lot about this. And I thought a lot about her, and I wondered if she would ever communicate with me. I went into my bedroom a few weeks after she died, and I found in the middle of the room, pointing towards the door so that I could read it, a bookmark, and written on the bookmark was, "Love from Margarita." Now, Margarita had probably given me that bookmark years ago as a Christmas present when she was a student of mine or whatever. But I had no recollection of it, no memory of it. I had no idea where it would have been. As I say, I have hundreds, thousands of books. If I add in all my other areas of books, 2,000 books. My house is full of books. The shelves groan with books. The floor is littered with books. I'm constantly tripping over books. I love books, part of my life. My books are my friends. They speak to me. That bookmark may have been in one of the books somewhere in my house. But certainly, I'd no idea where it was. I'd no recollection of ever having received it from Margarita, although, like other students, of course, she would tend to give me a little present at Christmas time, Christmas card, something like that. So I'd no idea where it was, and the fact that it was picked out in the middle of the bedroom floor, windows closed, even if the windows had been open and there'd been a gale blowing and the bookmark had been resting precariously on a bookshelf, it would not have ended up on the floor just by the entrance as you go in, arranged the right way round, so I read "Love from Margarita." My response to that was, "Oh, thank you, Margarita. That's nice. That's really nice." These small things happen. Another example, another of my PhD students who died recently. Sorry, this is all about death. The first one, Margarita, was killed in a car crash. The second one, Zahida, poor soul, died of lung cancer, though she had never smoked in her life, but her husband smoked. So it must have been secondary smoke. Anyway, she very much wanted to publish a book of her PhD thesis. So after she died, I arranged to have the book published, and I wrote the foreword to it. And one day I was walking through the dining room, and there was a Buddha, just the head of a Buddha, which she'd given me from a very, very old statuette found in India. And as I went through, I put my hand on the head of the Buddha and I said, "Oh, come on, Zahida, it's time you communicated with me." Went into my study, sat down, turned on the computer, opened my computer files, and what happened was that the foreword to the book that I had written, without my opening it, without my going to that file, had gone somewhere else, as soon as I tapped the key, that foreword came up. Now, I don't know a great deal about computers, but I do know that that is a very, very unusual happening. I'm opening thousands of files on my computer. I'm always doing it. I'm there every day doing it. That is the only time that has ever happened. And I hadn't been working on that forward recently. It was just there, it was on my hard disk, and that was that. So there are these events. And the more you look for them, the more you accept that these things happen, the more they're likely to happen. And then another simple example of from psychical research. Ingrid has considerable psychic abilities, in my view. And she tends to downplay these. But we've had experience. I'll give another reference to one of the most remarkable experiences in my career in psychical research later on, which concerns Ingrid. Some of you have heard it before. But on this occasion, we were sitting together in a cafe. It was on Kensington High Street, in fact. And she had a crystal around her neck, and she uses a crystal sometimes for dowsing purposes. And I said to her, well, look, let's just put this to the test. We'd often talked about it, or we must put this to the test, but we'd never done it. So I said to Ingrid, let's put this to the test. And she said, oh, all right, then go on if you must, yes, as she does. So I tore off a page from my notebook. I divided it into 10 small pieces of paper. And on each one of those, I wrote a question. She couldn't see. She was sitting on the other side of the table. She wasn't trying to look anyway, and I was doing it like this. I wrote a question on each one. And each question had a simple answer, yes or no. No, nothing equivocal about them. Like Elizabeth I was the first Queen of England, yes or no. Something like that. It wasn't. I didn't actually use that one. I'm just giving that as an example. I'm just giving that as an example. And I folded them up, and one by one, I put them on the table. She couldn't see what was on them. And she dowsed, and she said, the answer to that's yes, or the next one, the answer to that's no, and so on. 10 questions. Now, of those 10 questions, she got a run of 9 correct. The last one, I think, was wrong. But 9 correct, the odds against that, well over 1,000 to 1 against. So, again, there are these things that prove beyond any reasonable doubt we have these psychic abilities. Yes. Very, very excited. I mean, this was an incredible result because it was under very, very carefully controlled conditions. In other words, I was controlling, and there was no question at all about the genuineness of each of these things. So there is no question of the reality of psychic phenomena, and in my view, there is no question of communication with those who departed. People will say, yeah, what does all this mean? Does it come from the unconscious and so on, or does it really come from someone else? Let's forget that for the moment. But let's go on. And I'm going to start at the point of near-death experiences and deathbed visions. Deathbed visions are those occasions when the individual seems to be aware of other people around their bedside when they're dying. One of my own examples of this, my mother. I have mentioned this before in different contexts, so some of you will have heard this. My mother, nearing the end of her life, she died fairly recently. She was 92 when she died, and she remained absolutely clear and lucid right up to very near the end. And she used to say to me when I went to visit her, she lived fairly near, I went to visit her, and she would be sitting in her lounge, broad daylight, and she'd say, David, who are all these other people in the room? Now, she was absolutely clear and lucid. She wasn't on any drugs. There was nothing to suggest that she was hallucinating. Who are all these people in the room? And, of course, one always accepts these things as fact when one comes across these experiences. So I'd say, Mother, this is very, very interesting. I can't quite see them. Can you tell me who they are? She said, I can see them on either side of me. Now, this peripheral vision, my great friend, Dr. Peter Fenwick, who's doing a lot of work on near-death experiences, has noticed and noted the fact that often these things are peripheral. So you could see them out of the corner of either eye. And she just mentioned, matter-of-factly, my mother had no particular interest in psychical research. She knew I was involved in it, no particular interest. Who are all these people, David? And I'd say, well, can you tell me who they are, Mother? No, she said, I'm not quite sure who they are, but I can see all these people. And then nearer the end of her life, she was in a care home at that point, and I was visiting her. She was sitting here, and she said, David, who is that woman standing in the room? And of course I looked around. Oh, yes, Mother, that's very... can you tell me who it is? I can't quite see her. And she described her and so on. It sounded to me like her mother when she was younger. But I didn't go into details with her, just accepted matter-of-factly. Oh, she's here, that's nice. And we move on from there. But deathbed visions are of that order, but they're often very, very clear, very specific. And sometimes people around the bedside also see the hallucination. Could I have the first one, please, Kendall? This is incredible. Look what happens. He raises his hand like some wizard, and immediately it appears on the screen. Now, a clear distinction in this case between the spirit body and the physical body. This is a very typical case. This one is taken from the literature, but it is so typical and representative that you can take it as standing for hundreds of these. A vague outline, hazy fog-like substance, suspended motionless above the body. So this is a description of an onlooker. In fact, it was a medical doctor's description. A vague outline. Then I was astonished to see definite outlines present themselves. And soon I saw a fog-like substance assuming a human form, resembling the physical body of my aunt. The form was quiet, serene, and in repose, even though the physical body was writhing unconsciously. That's an interesting thing, that often people who are dying are described by others as going through great pain. They're unconscious, but I know when my mother was dying, she would make very strange noises, groans, and so on, and you thought, well, there's something going on. But things like this are very reassuring, that is simply a reflex action in the physical body. The body is unconscious, and their reflex physical actions. After all, something very big is going to happen. Something is going to leave the body very shortly. The features were plainly seen, very similar to the physical face, save for a glow of peace and vigour instead of age and pain. The eyes were closed as though in sleep, and a luminosity seemed to radiate from the spirit body. That is absolutely typical. A friend of mine quite recently was at the bedside of his dying partner, and he consulted me about this because he had seen, in his case, a fog-like vapour arising from the body. And I still can't convince him that was actually the soul of his partner dying. He's still perplexed. Was it or wasn't it? I say, well, look at the literature. There are umpteen examples of this kind of thing. So deathbed visions suggest that the act of dying is not difficult, and that the transition is not hard, and that in many cases, though I'm not giving an example of it here, other people are seen in the room who apparently are helpers, as in my mother's case, I think, helpers who are there to take the soul on the next stage of its journey. The medieval people who knew far more about this kind of thing than we do, there's this nonsensical idea that you can't go back in the literature and read what they were writing 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, because these old guys knew nothing. Of course, they knew far more than we do, because they were much closer to death. They lived with the reality of death. People died at home. People died young. Victorian families, 8 children, 9 children, only 3 of them living perhaps to adulthood. They lived with the tragedy of death. And if you go back to medieval times, it was even more so. They died of plague. They died of simple little illnesses, which are cured now without any problem. They died from dirty water, from polluted air, all sorts of things. So they lived with their death. And I mentioned last night, very briefly, that their idea was you should make friends with your death. It's going to come one day. Get to know more about it. In the West now, we hide away from the reality of death. Because of that, of course, we don't learn about it, we don't understand it, and we're terribly, terribly afraid of it. But the more that you're able to befriend it and understand it, the less you're likely to fear it. And the Tibetans have a lovely Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, which gives a very clear and concise account of the dying process and of what happens afterwards. As I'll say later on, it's very cultural. These things are extremely cultural. Not everybody's going to experience the same thing. And if you come from one culture, you will experience death very much in the light of your own culture. Come from another culture, you'll experience something quite different. But nevertheless, there are similarities, important similarities. And in the Bardo Thodol, there is reference to the stages of dying. You're actually losing your senses. I think hearing is the last one to go, if I remember rightly. And the transition to the next world, the nature of the transition, and what happens afterwards. And the Lama will read the Book of the Dead to the dying person. This is your guidebook for the afterlife. Now, in Christianity, there is also a guidebook to the afterlife. The Ar Bueno Moriendi, The art of dying well. Isn't that lovely? The art of dying well. And the art of dying well, it doesn't go into the same details as the Bard of Thoddle, but it's essentially the same sort of thing, because what it is saying is the state of mind in which you die will determine your immediate experiences in the next world. And the Bueno Moriendi gives you very, very clear details about what your state of mind should be like. It should be focused on Christ. It shouldn't be caught up in earthly things. It shouldn't be concerned about your money, your fame, any of those things. Your mind should be perfectly clear and receptive and grounded in faith. And if you die well, then you will have better experiences in the immediate afterlife. In medieval times, there were also prayers against sudden death. Oh Lord, please spare me from sudden death. They would pray. Now why? Why does it matter? To the average Westerner, well, you can die, you die anywhere. You may die in your bed, you may die in pain, you may die in old age, you may die when you're young, you may die suddenly in a road accident, whatever. You're dead anyway. What does it matter? Oh yes, it does matter. It matters because of the frame of mind in which you die. And the person who is killed, one moment you're alive, next moment you're dead. You may not even know that you're dead. Let's have the next one. This is the experience. Some of you may have read this book. It's called Private Dowding. And it's written by a man called Wellesley Tudor Pole, who was a very respected man of letters and a good friend of Winston Churchill's. In fact, it was Wellesley Tudor Pole who suggested with Winston Churchill the silent hour, as it was called, in remembrance of the dead of the First World War. And it was the silent hour that then developed into the minute silence, the Cenotaph, Armistice Day, all these other things. Wellesley Tudor Pole was also very involved with Glastonbury and the excavations at Glastonbury and the discovery of the Glastonbury well. Michael would know all about this. So this is his experience. Wellesley Tudor Pole's soldier, this is Dowding, Private Dowding, was killed in the First World War, came through to Wellesley Tudor Pole, who didn't know the man. The whole thing was a surprise. Wellesley Tudor Pole was not a professional medium. He was an amateur medium. These things happened to him. He had these experiences. He was a deeply mystical man. He had these experiences from time to time. And Dowding said, I seemed in a dream. Soon I should wake up. It had happened so simply. A simple experience. No horror, no long drawn-out suffering. Shock comes later when comprehension dawns. Where's my body? Surely I'm not dead. My body was hoisted onto the stretcher, and I wondered when I should get back into it again. I imagined I was still physically alive, the whole of myself. The part of me that thinks and sees and feels and knows was still alive and conscious. Now, this is very important because it suggests that one takes over with one the faculties that one has. That thinks and feels and knows, all these things were there. And I stayed near the body all night. Then I lost consciousness and slept soundly. That seems strange. But time and again in these accounts, there's reference to a period of sleep after death. A period of sometimes rest and relaxation, particularly people who've gone through a very, very difficult dying process. And it seems, it means not sleep in the sense in which we understand it. That is how it's interpreted. A lot of these things are simply the interpretation that people put upon them. But it's a period of altered state of consciousness, if you like, where the consciousness becomes quiet and one is able, in a sense, then to get over some of the traumas of one's death. When I woke, my body disappeared. How I hunted and hunted. It began to dawn upon me that something strange had happened. Then the shock came. Without warning, suddenly, I was dead. I'd been killed. And we've lots and lots of accounts like this of people who died suddenly. Air Marshal Lord Dowding, who was head of Fighter Command at the time of the Battle of Britain, and was credited, in fact, with the success of the battle, was a deeply humane man, profoundly disturbed that he was sending young men to their death. And he found, through a medium, he wrote a very good book called Many Mansions. And a medium wrote to him, having read the book, and she said, yeah, well, we are getting contacts from a lot of young men who've died in the war. Would you like to come along and join our group and have sittings with us? Dowding did this, Lord Dowding did this, and had a number of experiences with young airmen particularly, but also young soldiers who had died and did not know that they had died. And he wrote The Lich Gate as a follow-up with a lot of these cases, and then another book called The Dark Star. And what was happening was that the group was giving these people guidance. They were telling them, look, you died, you have to call for help, and you have to go on, or you have to follow the light wall, or whatever form of words they were using. So death itself, then, was nothing to be feared, but what happened afterwards, and whether one could be ready or prepared for it, depended very much not only upon how one had lived this life, as we'll see in a moment, but on how one had prepared for death. If we go on from there, later Wellesley Tudor Pole saw Dowding as an apparition, and again his appearance was in the body. So a body is taken with us. Of course it's not the physical body, but it seems to be either a thought form in one's own mind of what one's body is like, or else, as some of the occult traditions tell us, it's an astral body, which is codeterminate with the physical body during lifetime. When the physical body is left behind, the astral body goes on, and as we'll see in a few moments, goes through the various levels in the next life until it reaches the formless levels, where it realizes that all this is illusion anyway. We've already had references to that. Nothing is as it seems in this physical world. Gary was talking about this yesterday. Nothing is as it seems. And Bernard and physicists would tell us, yes, this is absolutely right. Of course, this table is not solid. It's 99% empty space. And what is not empty space is in violent motion, which is why it looks solid. And even the parts that are in violent motion are not stuff in the way that we understand stuff. They're simply a form of energy. Nothing is as it seems. And that's true of your bodies. I'm looking at you now. I'm seeing a room full of delightful, very attractive people. But I know that you are not as I'm seeing you. I know that. We only experience a small spectrum, if you like, of realities. The physicists now would agree with us on this. But Dowding appeared in a body, so that, yes, one does take a body, and this astral body, let's call it an astral body for the sake of anything else, remains with one for some considerable time in the afterlife, until one supposedly moves to a state of pure consciousness where the illusory nature of all this stuff is finally recognized. This is part of the enlightenment of Buddhism, and one moves on to these higher realms. All this is left behind, which doesn't mean to say it's no use, which doesn't mean to say even that at the formless level one could reassume the appearance of body if one wished, but one has no need for it anymore. One has moved on. So the body appears to go into the next world together with our thoughts, our feelings, emotions, very much the person that we are now. And let's have another slide. We have many of these reports that the experience of death varies considerably because it's governed by the state of mind in which one passes over. This, again, was a communication through a medium. And the medium was Jane Sherwood, very, very good non-professional medium, who was highly psychic, excellent medium, and had many, many of these very, very explicit and highly intellectual communications. Again, many mediums get very, very simple, very straightforward stuff, which I like, because if somebody's grandfather comes through and says, you know, if you go up to my old bedroom and look behind the chest of drawers, you'll find an old pair of socks of mine that I dropped years ago. So you go upstairs, you move the chest of drawers, and the old pair of socks there. That is excellent evidence of some form, certainly of communication from paranormal sources, probably the deceased. But we also get material of this kind. I don't like the very high-sounding stuff. I've sat with mediums who are channeling some higher being and so on, and you listen to 20, 25 minutes, half an hour, more sometimes, of elaborate descriptions, most of which are said to tell us that we're making a mess of things, which we know anyway. But this kind of thing is of much more interest to me. The experience of death varies considerably. It seems to depend on the state of mind in which one passes over. Also, there's a vast difference between a sudden passing and a quiet and prepared one. Yeah, we've already seen that. The shock of an unnatural death sets the being in a mad turmoil. One finds oneself in a fantastic dream world with no continuity of experience. Chaos of unconnected states of mind have no proper framework of space and time. And much of this earlier nightmare could be avoided if one knows how to avail oneself of the help that is freely offered. In other words, what you're seeing here in part is the chaos of the mind even as it is in this world. And Gary was talking yesterday about the way in which one is aware of the mental chatter that goes on in one's own mind, and the mind is out of control. He was saying he couldn't stop thinking. Well, I have a little exercise I do with my undergraduates and with my postgraduate students, and if I'm taking a meditation workshop, we sit quietly and do meditation, and I say, just stop thinking. I look on my watch. 1 minute later, I say, well, how many people have been able to do it? Nobody. I think I told you once, actually I was referring to this when I was doing a session on meditation, that the only group that were an exception to this were medical doctors, who are a fairly tough-minded group. And several put their hands up, I was able to stop thinking. So I said, well, how did you do it? That's very interesting. Oh, I just told myself, I'm not thinking. Totally missing the point. But in deeper levels of a concentrative form of meditation, there comes an extraordinary stillness. And one realizes one is still there. You are still there. You are the observer of this stillness, but you are still there. You are not your thoughts, in other words. Thoughts come and go all the time. And it seems that the less we're able to control our state of mind, or to get back to the real state, because that is what the mind really is, empty. And it only gets filled with all this clutter because we allow it to. Very important to think, of course, but to think with some purpose when we want to think, and when we want to sit quietly and just experience stillness, we sit quietly and experience stillness. So it does depend very much then upon one's state of mind when one passes over. Let's go on, and just a brief mention of the near-death experience. Now, that's so well known, I'm not going to put up examples of that. Time is very pressing. But you all know about near-death experiences. The person is approaching death, sometimes actually is clinically dead, and then comes back and gives an account of the continuation of consciousness. One of the best examples, I think, was the Pam Reynolds case. Pam Reynolds had an aneurysm, which is a blood vessel, base of the brain, which is ballooning out. And if it bursts, that's it, you die. There's nothing that can be done for you. You die. So it has to be treated. Now, how do you treat it? Well, if it is in the position in the brain that it was in Pam Reynolds' case, you can't treat it because you can't get to it. It's quite low in the brain. You can't get to it. You would irreparably damage the brain if you even tried. So they developed a new technique, which has since then been used a few times. It's very rare, very difficult technique. You drain the brain of blood. Now you say you can't do that. You drain the brain of blood. The person is going to be irreparably brain damaged anyway. Even if you can do it for a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, they're going to come back to life as a vegetable. You can't do it. No, you're right. You can't, except under one circumstance. And that circumstance is in a state of deep freezing. A state of deep freezing. You lower the body's temperature down to a certain level where everything stops. Everything stops. And you check that everything has stopped, not only because you've got a continuous print out of brain activity, which is absolutely flat, but you put two little earpieces in which are producing a sound which you would not fail to hear if you were at all conscious. But we can go even further than that. We can say, well, it would register on the brain if you couldn't hear it. If there was any brain activity, these sounds would register on the printout from the brain. Pam Reynolds' case, nothing. Put into the state of deep freezing, blood drained from the brain, and that clears the decks, and you can go ahead. But not only is she clinically dead, But she is observably clinically dead. There is no brain activity. Everything is still. And yet, after the operation, and mercifully it was successful, it's about a 6-hour operation. You have about a medical team of 14 to 20 people. It's a very, very complicated business. And they didn't know in this case whether you could bring somebody back from that state. When they brought her back from the state, she had remained conscious throughout, not in that physical body. Outside her body, she gave an account of some of the operational techniques that were being used, which were rare and obscure, and which were perfectly correct. Now, in some near-death cases, people actually go on to what we call paralyzed conditions. They come back and they report most beautiful surroundings. They're met by dead loved ones, or they meet a being of light who they may describe as Christ or whatever. And then they come back afterwards and they're able to tell the tale. About 10% of cases of people who've been clinically dead report these experiences. What about the other 90%? Well, maybe it's a bit like a dream. When you're coming back up to consciousness, you don't carry these memories, just as you don't carry memories of the dream. So what happens is that the person says, I've died and I have no fear of death. On the follow-up study, something like 85% or 82% I think, of those who had these experiences have lost all fear of death. And even 10, 20 years later will say the same thing. It's changed their lives. So the near-death experience suggests we go, ultimately anyway, to paralyzed conditions, these beautiful conditions and so on. No, not quite. Not quite. Would that it were that way. But no, it is not. It seems that you are given a glimpse of this higher state. But there's an awful lot more, actually, after death, that you have to go through before you reach that state. Or in some traditions, you come back to this life before you actually reach that state. Well, let's move on quite quickly then. So we don't all go to the paralyzed conditions straight away. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, who's taken Professor Ian Stevenson, the late Ian Stevenson's post, and who I know very well and was over here a couple of times recently, and he was on the platform with me. Bruce has done a lot of work on negative NDE experiences. And in a small number of cases, they are relatively small, they're horrifying conditions. People seem to actually go through what one might describe as hell. They are jeered at by demons who say, no, it was all a con, all this business that you were told. There's nothing more than this, and you're going to stay in this terrible state for eternity, being tormented by these demons. Others say that they're not tormented themselves, but rather like Dante in his vision of hell, they see the suffering people all around them. They hear the moans and the cries of those who are in darkness and despair and all these other things. One of the best examples of this is a book by Howard Storm called My Descent into Hell. And he was so influenced by this, when he came out of this condition, he trained for the ministry and became an ordained minister. But he also found that if he called for help, he was given help. So I think it was Ramakrishna, wasn't it, the great Hindu saint that said, when you need God as a drowning man needs air, then you will find him. And we know that can happen in this life, when you're absolutely in extremis about something, maybe psychological suffering, depression, maybe physical thing, and you call for help. And that call is not pre-calculated, because that is all you can do in that moment. There's this call to help. Then it's given. I speak from experience, and I'm sure many people here also speak from that experience. Some people don't even get to this sort of state because they never realize that they're dead, and they may be earthbound spirits. And in one of the poltergeist cases that I investigated for 2 years, the Cardiff poltergeist as it's called, and saw the phenomena in broad daylight, absolutely no question that it was genuine. On one occasion, seeing phenomena when I was in the building on my own, and the family were away on holiday in the Norfolk Broads. I haven't got time to go into it, but I have given the example on 1 or 2 previous occasions, so many of you will know the details. But earthbound spirits seem to hang around here, and that's the best explanation that we have for them. Andrew was talking about this when he was discussing spirit release and so on, and some of his work as a psychiatrist yesterday. They seem to hang around, and some of them are very mischievous, it would seem, both from what Andrew was telling us, and again from the literature, that people can be overshadowed, where they feel that there is another presence that is influencing them all the time, or they can actually be possessed, where this other presence takes them over. I'm not going into that, that's Andrew's field. But again, there's plenty in the literature to support this, people who've had these experiences and who give us very, very graphic accounts and very moving accounts of these. Dr. Wickland wrote a wonderful book, 30 Years Among the Dead. 30 Years Among the Dead. He was a psychiatrist, and he found that there were some patients he could not help by normal medical means. And his wife was a medium, and she suggested to him, look, let's give it a try anyway. It does sound as if these people are possessed. Shall I try and contact, if there is a possessing spirit, shall I try and contact them? And you can talk to them, and then you can come to some sort of decision on how to help. For 30 years they did this. And a large number of his patients who could not be helped by normal means, schizophrenic patients, people who were possessed, people who had obsessive thoughts about suicide and so on, he was able to help in this way by talking to the possessing entity contacted by his wife, and usually with the patient, or very often with the patient not there. So it wasn't a matter of suggestion. The patient got well because he or she heard all these suggestions from the psychiatrist that he was sending the person to the light, he was helping them to move on, and so on. No. They often were not even there. Well, what happens if one does get to the early level beyond that of private doubting? What happens next? And where does one go? Well, the idea of levels in the afterlife is actually very important. And this was known to the early Christian church. Not only does Christ give us an indication, because he says, one of the most marvelous passages in the Bible, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, ye may be also. I know there's discussion about the translations and so on, but the idea there of different places, different levels is absolutely clear. And it was understood by the early church. And many of these early church fathers were talking from experience. These were people who were absolutely in the middle of these extraordinary experiences themselves. And Origen, one of the 2nd century church fathers, Origen said that the soul's ascent to God in the afterlife is marked by a hierarchy of stages. And we can hardly expect, obviously, to be made perfect in one go. This is the teaching. There's a lot of work still to be done. We are a work in progress. We are not the finished article. And we cannot assume that death will make saints out of sinners or make saints out of us. So we can't assume this. So there seems to be an awful lot that we have to go through. And what are these stages or planes? Well, I'm going to use, it doesn't matter what terms you use, and these are speculative in the sense that one can't give scientific evidence for them, but they are borne out by the literature. And these 4 stages occur time and time again in the communications that we have received from mediums. These formless levels, the Buddhists are the best people at describing those. The Christian would say, well, we're talking about the kingdom of heaven here, closeness to God, and so on. The Buddhists, particularly the Tibetan Buddhists, make very, very clear what happens in the plane of pure flame, pure light, and the 7th plane. Contemplation of the supreme mind, or becoming one with the supreme mind, going into nirvana, the Buddhists might say, closeness to Christ or to God, the Christian might say. People struggle to put these things into words. How can you? And I'm not going to deal with these 3 planes, firstly because I don't have enough time, and secondly because they're so complicated that I might very well be misleading by what I say. So let's just look at these 4 planes here. Firstly, the earth plane. Well, we know all about that. And earthbound spirits, these guys who may or may not be hanging around, this room may be full of them. Who knows? We don't know. We don't know. We don't know how close they are to us. We don't know. We all have psychic abilities, but we allow them to atrophy because we never use them. That's why I said early on, go out and look for these things. And when you find them and you become convinced of the reality of these things, then they tend to happen to you. But the next plane is the Hades level. Hades level actually sounds quite interesting. There are references to it, of course, in the Greek traditions. That's where we get the name Hades from. And there are also references to it in the Jewish tradition, references to Sheol, the land of shadows, where in the Jewish tradition, and I wish my dear friend Les Lancaster was here because he would be able to correct me, but as I understand it in the Jewish tradition, one remains in this state of Sheol until the good Lord eventually, at the end of time, judges. And then you go to other places. And many people say, well, Jews are not very interested in the afterlife. Well, there aren't that many references to it in the Old Testament, but there are a number. And one of the most beautiful, I think, is poor old Job, who was going through this terrible suffering, as you know. And he was a good man, and people said, why is he going through all this suffering? And Job's comforters were his friends who kept rushing in and saying, poor guy, and all this, that, and the other. And Job says at one point, referring to God, yea, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Yea, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And that is a clear reference, of course, to the afterlife. One day God will slay me, I will die, I have to go. Yet will I trust him. So I know that my trust in him is going to go on. Well, at the Hades level, and there's some lovely descriptions of Hades. I'll just give one or two. Let's see if this one. No, it's a plane of illusion. Maybe I didn't put these up because they're quite short and time is very pressing. Maurice Barbanel, who was a very, very well-known medium, leading medium, and actually a very clever man. Some mediums are very clever. Most of them are actually not interested in the literature. Interestingly, people say, well, medium's read a book and she's giving you back the descriptions of the afterlife she's read in the book. No, most mediums don't read. They're not interested in the literature. They tend to be very, very self-centered. Sometimes one wonders with some mediums, well, where is the spirituality in all this? But there are some, and they tend to be the amateur mediums who are highly intellectual. Maurice Barbanel was an intellectual. Well, when he died, he was communicating through Mary Sherry, who is retired now, but an excellent medium. And he refers to it like walking around in a fog, he says. Almost like trying to stop myself daydreaming. And he was quite surprised, actually, by this. He thought he would bypass all these early stages. He found he didn't. Many communicators refer to it as a shadowy, dreamlike condition. However, they also suggest it's not necessarily to be feared. F.W.H. Myers, who was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, communicated material through Geraldine Cummins, who was a very, very well-known author and playwright, and who happened to have the ability of automatic writing. And Myers, supposedly, communicated through her and gave very, very clear and specific directions as to his experiences. He said that Hades is the lowest level of the afterlife, and it can be a place of rest, of half-light and drowsy peace. As a man wins strength from a long, deep sleep, so I gathered the spiritual and intellectual force that I needed. The individual, it seems, is affected in a different manner by this place or state on the frontiers between two lives, on the borders of two worlds. So it can be a rather horrifying, especially if you have no belief in an afterlife and you suddenly find yourself in this shadowy, misty place, then you may be very frightened indeed. But if you know what it is, as Myers is saying, it's a place of drowsy peace and rest, where you recuperate, especially if you've gone through a difficult life and you've gone through a lot of suffering and pain before your death. Albert Porchard, who is founder and president of the Geneva Metaphysical Society, again a leading figure in his field, communicated after death that it was like a feeling of bliss and liberation initially. This is what happens as well in near-death experiences, feeling of great bliss and liberation. Then he seemed to be in a dark region where he walked along a seemingly endless road and was aware at one point that there was no sky, no depth, no perspective, no free space. There was nothing, I was alone in a desolating solitude. When he emerges from that state, he's told, well, this is what largely caused by what he's taken with him, which was a lot of very deep depression that he'd been going through. And that his experiences in Hades then were influenced by this state of mind, effectively. Jane Sherwood, one of her communicators, again, a very, very good amateur medium and a lady of letters, one of her communications said, I spent a long sojourn in what I think of as Hades, the place of the shade, dim and formless world, which I believe is peopled by the miasma of earth emotions and the unconscious projections of its inhabitants. The next stage seems to be, we call it purgatory. This is the stage, it's not punishment. I mean, even hell under these conditions is not supposed to be punishment. It is an opportunity for learning, for re-education, and for repentance. So that there is a past life review that is supposed to take place at this stage. We, it seems, carry with us all our earth experiences. And sometimes one gets a glimpse of this in a near-death experience. Our dear friend Martin was explaining to me, he nearly drowned once. And he had this life preview. And he described it as panoramic. And again and again in the literature they say the same thing. It's not that you go through event after event. It's all there. That's right, Martin? Yeah. All there simultaneously. Mercifully, Martin did not drown, although had he done so, I'm sure he would be guiding us from the next world. You know, we take this very seriously. Well, Martin told me, no, we shouldn't do it like that. I'm afraid we can't, sorry. But, well, we have you with us, and we're very grateful for that, Martin. And this life review leads to a great deal of repentance, of course, because it is said that one actually experiences the emotional pain one has caused to others. And any other wrongdoings you actually experience as if you're on the receiving end of them. And purgatory is an opportunity to learn. Gosh, don't we want to learn? Don't we want to look back on our lives and see what went wrong and why it went wrong and where we messed up and why we messed up? Don't we want to feel some of the pain that we've caused others? Don't we want to? We may not look forward to this, but we would not be complete without it. You know, we have to do these things, whether we like it or not. And if we don't do these things, then we have not learnt the lessons of this life. And of course it is said by those traditions that teach reincarnation, certainly about 50% of mediums that I've worked with do accept reincarnation, about 50% doubtful or they don't. But it is said that from this point, if you don't learn these lessons, you may have to come back here. But that if you are able to learn these lessons, then you can move on. Hell is simply... Right, 4 minutes, right. Hell is simply said to be an extension, it's the lower end of purgatory, if you like. But it is made clear, certainly in the Christian tradition, and all traditions have their hells, but Tibetan Buddhism has 18 hells. And in certain sects of Buddhism, they have even more. But it's always made clear in Buddhism, since nothing is permanent, hell is not permanent. And one of the Buddhas, Siddhikarparaj, actually comes down into hell. That is his job. He comes down into hell to help those people who are repenting and call for help. Do we find that in the Christian tradition? Yes, indeed we do. That hell is not permanent. And that in hell, in fact, the only unforgivable sin, this is made clear in the New Testament, there is only one unforgivable sin. The others we may have to make up for in purgatory or whatever. But there's only one sin that can't be forgiven, and that's the sin against the Holy Spirit. Now, there's a lot of discussion as to what that means, and I think one of the accepted theological positions is that it means that you make out that what is bad is good. But I think it's more than that. I think the sin against the Holy Spirit is the rejection of spiritual belief, of God, of anything like that. You close your mind completely to that. And if you close your mind completely, then obviously you're not going to be able to make any kind of progress. It's like refusing to take the tablets if you're physically ill. No, you're not going to get better if you don't take the tablets. And so in hell it's said that it's not that you are sent there as a judgment. You put yourself there. And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Father Callistos Ware writes to say that you are there as it's your own decision, really. Hell is locked on the inside, is the message that is given. And it's said in the Christian church, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. We're all God's creatures. And God is not going to abandon people. But you have to, in a sense, make the first move. And if you don't accept the divine, I'm talking at the moment from the Christian point of view, but obviously other traditions will describe it in other ways, but they'll all be saying the same thing. Now, if you reject all this, you're not going to make any progress, of course. And until Sitigar Paraj in the Buddhist hells will not come down to help you unless you are calling out for help. Well, the plane of illusion, I got 1 minute for the plane of illusion, and it's the central part of the whole thing. Yeah, but that is the next stage after purgatory, which is very much a world of thought. Again, it's not real. It very much resembles this world, and this is where the cultural factors come in, because different cultures experience not only this world differently, but the next world differently. In the Bardo Thodol, there are descriptions of the wrathful deities, and there are descriptions of the helpful deities, or the Buddhas. Well, these are spiritual energies, and that is how they are personalized for the Tibetan Buddhist. But you wouldn't expect that people from this country are going to wake up on a windswept plain in Tibet with wrathful deities all around you, brandishing spears and breathing smoke and things like that. No, not at all. One sees the next world very much the plane of illusion and even the plane of colour. Although this is perfect, this is the ideal state. It is the final state of the world of form. And it's said that you only reach this after you've done all the work at the lower planes. And that if reincarnation takes place, it takes place up to 3. By the time you get here, no. And by the time you get there, unless you're a bodhisattva who comes back from here specifically to help others in this life. But the plane of illusion, so of course there are houses there. Of course one experiences a world very like this one, but it's an illusion. It is not real. One goes to places where there are others of a like mind to oneself. And so the environment is, in a sense, built by the sea of thoughts of those people. So if you love the country, you love gentleness, quietness, peace, you go to that kind of environment, which is then perfected at this level. Because the plane of illusion can be rather nasty. There are groups of people there that one would not want to go to, who have built a kind of illusory reality, which would not be the reality that we would want to enjoy. This reality is not built consciously. It is, if you like, generated by the thought fields, just as in a sense that is the way we experience this world. I'll just give 1 or 2 examples, and then I promise I'm going to stop. Just 1 or 2 examples. One young girl in her communications, who was obviously at the level of the plane of illusion, she said, yes, she was very happy, everything was fine. She had gone to a house that had been built by her family, and she was living with her family. And she said, but there's one puzzling thing. If we forget to think about one of the rooms in our house, it disappears. It's no longer there. You go through a door and there's no room. It's actually sustained by thought, good and bad. We're still carrying a lot of this good and bad stuff. Now, when we see through the illusory nature of much of this and have left behind much of this stuff, the next level, the plane of colour, the upper astral level, which is perfection, as I say, form in its absolute state of perfection. It is supposed to be the state of emotional harmony. All the people who live by violence and so on, they dropped out by that time. They're either still down here or maybe they've been reborn or whatever. Let us hope that they have been reformed or transformed by their experiences. But it's the plane of emotional harmony, plane of indescribable, exquisite beauty. It's always dangerous to try and look too far across cultures, but I would say that it sounds very like the Pure Land. that is Amida's Pure Land as well. And it said that Amida gives you the chance to reach final enlightenment, which is much harder down here. But in his Pure Land, you have that final chance, and then you move on here. Well, dear friends, I'm afraid that although there is so much more that could be said about, maybe I'll just talk about the plane of illusion next year and the plane of colour, because there's a massive detail that can be given about this. But I want to leave you really with the thought, A, of tremendous optimism about an afterlife, about a religion of love, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Christianity, whatever our tradition happens to be, where the ultimate reality is love, where people are cared for, where the way we've lived this life is very, very important in determining what happens in the next life, where the state of mind in which we die may determine certainly our immediate experiences. I remember the first retreat I went on in Tibetan Buddhism, that the Tibetan Lama saying that you could blow it all in the last moment. If you die in the wrong frame of mind, you may have lived a blameless life, but you can blow it all in the last moment. And I thought, oh gosh, oh no, surely not. But anyway, that's the teaching. So the frame of mind in which you die, be prepared for what is likely to happen, but Hades conditions, shadowy conditions, then moving up to the next level, plane of illusion, going from there, whatever. And that if you need help, you call for help. And people say, well, I saw Christ. Or the Buddhists may say, I saw the Buddha. What is it you see? Is that all Christ is? Is that all the Buddha is? No. It is the energy, and they are personifying it in that form to help us. Just as we symbolize things in this life that's been given to us to help us. Of course it is Jesus Christ, and of course it is the Buddha, but that is not all that they are. They are the energies of love, loving kindness, enlightenment, all these things, who are there to help us. Ask for help. Ask and it shall be given you. The Bible makes it absolutely clear. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For goodness sake, go and look, go and try. That's what it's saying to all of us. Well, let's try and live by some of those ideals at least. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. As always, interesting, informative, riveting to listen to, optimistic. We would never expect anything less from you anymore. I'm never 100% sure about all these things, but I'm always pleased to get evidence and confirmation that it's probably true. But I've decided I'm going to skip levels 1 to 3, go straight on to 4, and then into pure consciousness. I'm not taking a chance on the planes of illusion.
Well, it is said that good souls do miss out those early stages and go straight to the higher levels.
Now, it's interesting. I just would like to say this in support of what David was saying. I've told him this story of where this evidence comes from, where you don't expect it. I was sitting on a train 3 weeks ago, and I tend to chat to people on trains, and there was everywhere really, I chat to everybody. There was a little old lady sitting opposite me, and we started chatting, and then she told me about an operation, and she said, and I died. She said, I died, and I was dead for 1.5 minutes, clinically dead. And so I thought, I wonder if she'll think I'm off the wall. I said, did you have a near-death experience? And she said, she looked a bit confused. And then I said, did anything happen when you were dead? Did you notice anything or anything? She said, well, I did, She wasn't religious or anything. She said, I saw my husband coming towards me, and then all these people came and they started to lift me up. I said, what was it like? She said, well, they were all in white. It was all light and it was lovely. And they started to lift me up. And then they put me down or something like that. I can't remember everything because I was thinking of so many things. And she said, and then I came back. And I said, what did that mean to you? She said, well, I don't know. I never really thought about it since. I just thought, oh, that's strange. So she wasn't somebody who had a strong conviction. And this is what, for me, makes it more real. She didn't have a conviction about it. She never really thought about it. She just said, oh, well, that happened. And she said it was real. It happened. But she didn't think about it after, like it was something amazing. And to me, I thought, now that's really, really good. So anyway, I'm not going to steal the rest of the time. We have 2 minutes if somebody'd like comments or questions. Bernard?
David, just like a clarification about this scheme of the about where the scheme of the seven planes comes from. I mean, I always associated that with the theosophical tradition, but I suppose that itself is related to the Tibetan tradition.
Certainly.
So is this one particular scheme, but I suppose in other cultures that you have a somewhat different classification?
Well, the classification, the study, the wording would be different. But the idea of Hades, the idea of some form of purgatory, hell realms, occurs in all, I think, the great traditions. There is the teaching of reincarnation, which is much stronger in Buddhism, and particularly Hinduism, where you tend to come back very quickly here. But the idea of formless realms, the idea of the plane of illusion, that the next world is illusory and so on. The Buddhist, the Bardo Thodol, says, don't get caught in the plane of illusion. Don't get caught. Look for the clear light. Go towards the clear light. Even if you're in these wonderful conditions, it's not ultimate reality. And so there's a shortcut, a much quicker way out of this. Go towards the clear light of bliss, which is the ultimate, which is nirvana, if you like, the Buddha. These words are hopelessly inadequate.
Just as a coincidence, I mean, in the scheme I described yesterday, this hard dimensional reality structure, there are, as it happens, 7 planes, because in string theory, that's the number of dimensions. Well, maybe that's just a coincidence, but I mean...
Well, 7 is a very mystical number, as you know, and it does occur in all the great traditions. So that I think these 7 levels are simply a useful way of thinking about it, of pegging one's mind on the idea that there is a progression. And that one progresses for a while in an illusory world, which is very similar to this. As Paul Beard says, the bricks and mortar are not substantial in the way that they are in this world. When you have finished your use for them, they disappear. It's not that people are constantly building their own houses in the next world and that they're always going to be there. No. It fades and it disappears when you've finished using it and you go on. Like the little girl from the Plane of Illusion who said, the room in the house disappears when we're not using it, we're not thinking about it, and it's gone. So it's a simply, I think, a useful way, Bernard, of looking at this idea of progression. How it would map on to your theory, we can talk about that between ourselves, because I think this would be a very, very interesting point to pursue. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.